Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is read. Let's take a look at some of the definitions or ways we use this verb. The first way the verb read is used is to mean to look at carefully so as to understand the meaning of something written or printed. A second way we use this verb read is to mean to discover information by seeing it in a written or printed source. A third way to use this verb is to mean to inspect and record the figure indicated on a measuring instrument. So this might be something you do during a scientific experiment, again, looking at a particular measuring device, reading it, so identifying a certain number and recording that number. Read is an irregular verb. To make the progressive tense, all we need to do is add ing to form reading. The past tense and participle forms of this verb have the exact same spelling as our base verb, but the pronunciation changes. Our past tense and participle forms should sound like the color red. Red. Let's take a look now at some phrasal verbs with read. The first one we'll look at is to read something off, and that simply means to read aloud from a list. Let's take a look at this phrasal verb in an example sentence. Will you read off the names of the people in the first and second groups? Another phrasal verb you might hear people use is to read something over or to read something through. And these two phrasal verbs really have the same meanings. And the first meaning for it, for either of these, is to read something from beginning to end. So read it all the way through. Another way to think of it. So if you look at my first example sentence, we'll see an example of read through. He read through the brochures. A second way to use read over or read through is to read all of something, again, so connected to that first meaning, but this time you're looking for mistakes or errors. Perhaps you're checking the document to make sure it is accurate or correct. So let's look at an example of that. Can you read over my essay? So if someone was asking me that, I would think they want me to check the essay. The last phrasal verb we'll look at is to read up on, and it means to research and learn more about a particular subject or topic. Here's an example sentence. I'm going to read up on the rules and procedures before our meeting. So this is someone suggesting I'm going to research and learn more before we have a meeting. Let's continue practicing using the verb read in a few different verb tenses. Today, we'll look at the past perfect, simple present, and present perfect progressive. Let's start with the past perfect. To make this verb tense, we're going to use had and then the participle form of the verb. Okay? Let's take a look at an affirmative example. The lawyers had read over the document prior to the hearing. So there you can see my two parts, and you'll notice my pronunciation of the verb changed because it's the participle form. If I want to make a negative sentence in past perfect, you're going to see me insert not after had. You might hear native speakers use the contraction hadn't. Let's look at an example. I hadn't read much about the Spanish flu pandemic before this year. And finally, if I want to make a yes or no question in the past perfect, where I'm going to start with had, then I'll have my subject, and then the participle. Here's another example. Had they read the assignment before class started? What you might be noticing here in the past perfect is I've used the phrases prior to and before, and that's because this verb tense is indicating an action was completed at or before a certain point in time, or at or before another action. Next, let's take a look at the simple present. We use this to talk about habits and routines. We also use it to talk about facts. Let's take a look at an affirmative example. He reads the newspaper every day. So this is a great example of a habit or a routine. And the key thing to remember in the simple present is that if our subject is he, she, or it, the verb is generally going to have an S or an ES and with certain spelling combinations at the end of it. If our subject's I, you, we, or they, the verb just stays the way it is in its base form. Next, let's look at a negative simple present tense. To make negative simple present, I'm going to use do not in the base verb. That will be with my subjects I, you, we, and they. Or I'll use does not in the base verb with the subjects he, she, and it. Again, you might hear native speakers use the contractions don't and doesn't. Here's an example sentence. Some students don't read over their papers before they turn them in. And turn them in here, it just means submit them for a grade. Next, let's look at making a yes or no question in the simple present. To do this, we're going to start with do or does, then we'll have our subject, and then the base verb. Does she read before bed each night? Next, let's look at present perfect progressive. There are 3 parts to this verb tense. I like to remind my students of that. We have the 3 P's, so think 3 parts. And our 3 parts in the affirmative are going to be have or has, depending on our subject, then been, B-E-E-N, and then the progressive or ing form of the verb. And we're using this verb tense to talk about an action that started in the past and it continues into the present. Here's an affirmative example. I've been reading up on the new guidelines for in-person classes. So again, here's someone indicating they're researching, they're learning more about new rules for working with students in person. If I want to make negative present perfect progressive, I need to insert not after has or have. Many times you'll hear native speakers use the contraction form, haven't or hasn't. Here's an example sentence. She hasn't been reading for pleasure much since school started. Finally, if I want to make a yes or no question in the present perfect progressive, I will start with have or has, then I'll have my subject, then been, then the ing form of the verb. Here's an example. Have you been reading the news lately? Next, let's take a look at some words that are related to our verb read. The first is a noun, reader, and you're going to notice that this can have a few different meanings. The first way we use this noun is to mean a person who reads or a person who is fond of reading, and fond of reading means you like it usually a great deal. Here is an example of that meaning in a sentence. Readers of the local newspaper know that it covers education news. So here we're identifying a specific group of people who read a particular newspaper. A second way to use the noun reader is to mean a book designed to give learners of a language practice in reading. Here's an example of this meaning in a sentence. The teacher gave the first graders new readers. This is new books as these first graders are learning to read. way that this noun is used is to mean a device used for reading or obtaining data stored on tape, cards, or other media. Here's an example of that usage in a sentence. The small business uses a card reader that attaches to a smartphone. And I think that might be the most common phrase you hear with this particular noun, a card reader, right? Because that is so commonplace now with our IDs, with our credit cards, debit cards, etc. The next word we're going to look at is an adjective. It's readable, and it means able to be read, or we can kind of connect back to that last meaning of a device used to obtain data. So capable of being processed. So if for some reason you were scanning something, can the device read your object, your ID, for example? So let's take a look of readable in a sentence. The author's new book is readable and enjoyable. The last word we'll look at today is sort of the opposite of our last adjective. It's unreadable. And you might recognize that prefix un is meaning not. So this adjective is not clear enough to read or not capable of being processed. Let's look at this adjective in a sentence. Unreadable license plates are a safety problem. Okay. Thanks so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.